Hello and welcome back to Talking Insights, the podcast series from Esomar. I'm your host, Shrika Govindaraju, and throughout this series we're taking a closer look at the key topics of today, taking a step beyond the world of research and insights to tackle the big issues of our time. Our sector deals with understanding and predicting the world that we live in, so let's look beyond the numbers and dive into the most important conversations of today that will shape our tomorrow. Trust is one of the most important values in society. Whether it's trust in governments, in the media, or in the companies and businesses that we choose to give our hard-earned money to. Consumer trust plays a pivotal role in the rise and fall of brands across all sectors the world over, and yet trust is more often than not a vaguely defined notion rather than a firmly quantifiable metric. As consumers become more discerning with their choices, based on a company's human rights records, its environmental impact, or the ethics of its business, how do corporate actions in these areas affect consumer trust? How are companies building or losing trust in the time of COVID? And how is a new model of trust developed by Brandsy at Kantar changing the way in which we can measure trust in some of the biggest companies on the planet? Well, I'm delighted today to be joined by Graham Staplehurst, Global Strategy Director and Chief Thinker at Kantar Brandsy. Graham has over 30 years' experience covering almost every area of research, trading with Research International and Millward Brown, before spending time at Unilever, PepsiCo, Vodafone, and Nestle, amongst others. He's worked across the globe from Guatemala to Bulgaria, Norway to Singapore. Currently, Graham writes and consults with global clients on strategy as part of the global Brandsy team and leads the development and analysis of Brandsy's world-leading brand equity solutions. Graham, thank you very much for taking the time to join us today.
Pleasure to be with you. Thank you very much for inviting me.
So I think, first of all, let's just a little introduction. Can you tell us a little bit about Brandsy itself as a kind of business unit? How did it come about, and what's the main focus of the work that you carry out?
Well, Brandsy was originally a partnership with WPP. They have a lot of advertising and media agencies, and they needed to better understand the brands that they were creating advertising and media plans for in order to make those plans as effective as they could be. So they talked to us, we were at Millward Brown at the time, in 1998, and said, can you set up a system to comprehensively measure large numbers of brands across the major economies of the world? And that's exactly what we did. So it started out over 20 years ago. And we started off in 7 countries. We research in more than 40 each year now. We do hundreds and hundreds of studies every year, interviewing thousands upon thousands of people. I think we counted up and we've interviewed over 3 million people or something.
Oh, wow.
Over all that time. And we use a very standardized framework of brand equity where we ask people basically a series of relevant questions about brands in a category. And then from that, we analyze the data and understand what is driving their choices. And with that, anyone involved in planning and strategy for brands and marketing communications can get a really good understanding of the job to be done. So where the brand is strong that you can exploit, where the brand is weak that you need to correct, and also how to do it. Some inspiration into what the best solution might be.
And it's, for me, the one thing that struck me, so when I saw your article on Research World, which I do urge any listeners to read as well. So can trust carry brands through good times and bad? One of the first things that occurred to me was, trust in my mind is something quite abstract as a notion. Trust, especially when you're talking about brands, you're talking about companies, it really varies a lot from person to person. So one of the things I was wondering is how did you, and with the team at Brandsy, how did you create that model of trust, of kind of quantifying trust, and build the kind of rankings that you put together eventually as well?
Well, there's 2 sides to that. So one is that with colleagues at Kantar, we've done a lot of qualitative work to understand this notion of trust and what underlies it. Now, a lot of people will nowadays be familiar with Kahneman's work in terms of two types of thinking process that our brain employs. Type 1, the very fast, instant decision making that requires very little brain effort. And you may not even be conscious of the way that process works, because for many of us, we have dozens and dozens of brand choices to make every time
Yeah.
we go to a supermarket, or even just in our everyday life. But there's also type 2 thinking, which is more considered, and you use your memories to a larger extent then in an active way. So you're thinking about a wider range of associations, and trust actually plays into both of these systems. So trust, in partly how we're measuring it when we ask people, is this a brand that you trust? They're giving us a very instinctive reaction, and it's not highly considered, but in categories where trust, where the decision has more importance, maybe there's a larger risk involved, a financial risk or a reputational risk, then trust obviously becomes more important that you consider it, and so it enters into the type 2 decision making as well.
And so interesting when you mentioned that these two different ways of thinking. So if you had to give, it might be a tricky question, but this kind of trust that we're speaking of that comes from consumers, if you had to define that trust, in the sense of a consumer relationship with a particular company, with a particular brand, do you have a kind of metric that you use either in-house or, for yourself? Do you have a definition that you go to when you say the word trust in this context?
Well, yeah, I mean, and it's what we've been doing since we started on Brand Z, and we've done for many years. We simply ask people, is this a brand that you trust? Now, it's what you do with that metric afterwards, how you diagnose it, how you understand its relationship to other factors that impact on brand choice. And it turns out it has a very close correlation with brand choice. And another framework that we use at Kantar is something we call the meaningfully different framework. And we believe that brands thrive and grow when they are more meaningfully different to consumers. And what we know is that meaningfulness, now that in itself, is quite an intangible concept.
It gets quite abstract, yeah.
It is, but it actually has two really quite solid components. You get meaning from a brand if it does a job for you. If it does the job. Google is meaningful to me because I know when I go into a Google search engine and I try to find something, it's going to be pretty good at helping me. So Google has some meaning in that way. But meaning also is that emotional affiliative response that we have to brands, that we just like some more or we just trust some more. So trust is part of that affiliative side of brands. And actually, if you think about it, trust is the shortcut that we use to prevent us from having to think more intently about anything.
Yeah.
If I go to the cinema and there's a film on and it's made by a director I know and trust because I've seen films from them before, I'll think, yeah, that's good. We'll try it out. If I'm driving down the motorway in France on holiday and I go past a petrol station and I'm thinking, do I need to get some fuel or not? And if it's a brand I don't recognize, maybe I'll pass it by and I'll wait to see a Shell garage or something that I recognize. And that's the sort of way that it works. It's just helping you to make very fast, simple decisions. As we've had to do ever since human consciousness started to evolve. And people had to trust the plants that they ate or the creatures that they hunted weren't going to fight back, and so on. So, trust's been around forever.
That's very interesting because when I first kind of came across the article and I was reading into the work that you were doing, I was thinking, a lot in terms, like consumer brands. So I was thinking of, my own kind of choices, brands that I trust. Let's say if I want to buy a pair of jeans, I'll normally go look at some Levi's because that name is kind of synonymous to me with that kind of quality. But
Mm-hmm.
the example you mentioned then, in terms of even something like a petrol station, I think that's quite clear that it filters down into a lot more levels than you would initially expect. It's not just these kind of big ticket items. Is it?
Yeah.
Do you notice that it's a lot more day to day kind of essentials as well?
Yeah. And some of the things that when you were talking in the introduction that you talked about, those are more conscious elements of trust. And that's more in the head. But trust is also in the heart. I mean, who do you trust most? Your life partner. So, trust is absolutely in the heart as well as in the head. And it's part of your emotional response to things, as well as, your rational response to them.
So, moving off that kind of that definition of trust and that framework that you built, looking at the actual, the brands and the businesses that you do name in the report too, do you have some kind of key hallmarks or key differentiating factors of the businesses that build trust? One of the quotes that I took away from the article that you wrote was, trust takes time to build. And are there some kind of common factors between the brands that are really built up this level of trust over time?
Yeah, I mean, there are several different sides to trust. It is an abstract concept, and because of that, it naturally is affected by a lot of different factors. Now, the traditional roots of brand trust, very specifically, really fall into two areas. First of all, the expertise or the quality of the product itself. And, does it reliably and consistently deliver what you are expecting it to do over time? One of the very first brands that we know about, or a category of brands, was in beer. People, the brewers started putting marks on their barrels, and that was so that people would know if I'm drinking from one of these, the beer is going to be safe, and reliable. And ultimately, once you got past, sort of in a Maslowian hierarchy sense, it's not going to kill me. That's great. So, then is it going to taste good? Is it going to deliver some positive qualities on top of that? So, that's the first side of it. The other side is more the social and reputational side. And so, large companies, tended to gain trust from that social currency. If they're that big, if everyone else is buying things from them, they must be trustworthy, even if I don't know them very well. And in this day and age, we're a little bit more questioning about businesses, and many people are concerned about exactly what companies are doing. So what we've seen in our latest analysis, and the amazing benefit that I have of working with Brand Z, is that I've got a database of thousands and thousands of brands, and I can look in and say, what's making trust these days, and how is that different from how it used to be? And what we can see now is that it's driven more by the responsible elements of corporate behavior, and that perception that this is a company that takes account of the needs of society, of employees, of its supply chain, of the environment, and the planet around us. So those are sort of the two sides of what I think of as traditional trust, or the traditional roots of trust. And if you look at some of those brands on the list, brand like Pampers, for example, that heads up the list, that's because it's reliably and consistently delivered on what people expect, and it promises a lot to mums and dads, especially to new ones that are very uncertain about their new baby, but it delivers on those promises and those expectations it sets up.
Now, I just want to touch back on. I was very interested by the example you mentioned before, then about historically with the brewers, people
Mhm.
branding their beer to as a market quality. It got me thinking. I think some back to my family back in India. Let's say where in our hometown, there's certain shops that they will still go to now, 40, 50 years on from
Yeah.
when they first went there. So how is it? Over time, as you look at this kind of historical development of brands and of these companies, how has that notion of trust shifted as you move from, let's say, producers and brands that are much more local, kind of local producers, to now when we're dealing with these large scale multinational companies that may operate, most, if not all countries on the planet? How does that trust scale up as businesses scaled up over time?
Yeah. Well, I think it sort of fundamentally comes back to do you consistently deliver still? So, a brand like Colgate has been very successful in growing around the world, hundreds of countries where it's sold because it's a great product. And people know that they can rely on it to deliver. Locally, you may or may not know about the company
Mm.
behind it. It may or may not matter to you. Um, and we see, as I said, sometimes it comes out, and sometimes in a negative way. So we know that, I don't know, some of the water brands in the US, for example,
Yeah.
have had issues with extract, being seen to extract water out of the ground in areas where there are droughts.
Hmm.
Um, and so, no matter how great their water that they're selling is, they still then have to think about, are we communicating how we're behaving in a responsible way effectively to people, or are social factors getting in the way of us there?
I do want to come back to as well the responsible behavior, because I
Mm,
think that's a huge topic, especially
mm,
today, as you mentioned
mm,
before. Just to stay on this kind of notion of businesses building this up over time. To me, sometimes in my head, I have, when I see brands today, I have this quite clear distinction between, I guess, what I term to myself as kind of legacy companies, the kind of long-lasting companies, and you kind of newer, more startups. So I think of, let's say, if you speak about cars, something like Mercedes-Benz versus Tesla,
yeah,
as kind of these two different sides.
yeah.
So, do you see, from your research, is there a difference in how these legacy established companies bring about feelings of trust in consumers compared with these newer startups, compared with your kind of Teslas and TikToks of the world?
Yeah. Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, that really led us, when we were looking at our data, to look for an additional way of explaining why people trusted brands. Because um, as one of my colleagues expressed it, the first time you booked an Uber or an Airbnb and you were going to go and stay in someone else's house, I mean, there's a huge amount of trust involved
Yeah.
in those two acts, right? Um, and you don't have the long history. You don't have experience of them consistently delivering. You don't even know much about them as a company, to have proven that. So, what do you rely on? Well, you rely on, it turns out, and particularly important for younger people and these exciting new brands that are hitting us from the digital space, in particular, um,
Hmm.
a, a sense of inspiration. So, although I can go on proven track record to trust a brand, I can also um, be inspired to trust that brand by its behavior. And there are three components to that inspiration. Um, First of all, that the brand is open and honest. It's operating clearly with integrity. So, when you think about Uber, then, they tell you how much you're going to pay before you get in the car. They'll
Yeah.
show you the route. They'll show you where the driver is. Huge amounts of transparency in that. Also, really important is a way of connecting to people that the consumers, the users, the buyers will identify with. So that's to say, you are someone like me, and your brand or your product, your service has been developed for people like me.
Hmm.
Now, manufacturers often, will struggle with this because they'll have a clever, innovative manufacturing idea and then say, how do we sell this? right? Whereas actually a lot of these new services and so on have arisen because there's a real identifiable opportunity and need that's going to satisfy a consumer group. So, if you think about it, well, the people that go to Airbnbs are probably, particularly in the early days when it's an unknown brand, the sorts of people who would, be happy to actually have guests in their own home, perhaps, and so on. So you've got that identification, and it's like, that's the way that we travel these days. I sofa surf, or I'll hitchhike, or whatever else.
Mm-hmm.
The third ingredient is very, very important to modern society and younger people in particular, and that's a sense of inclusion. So that you build a sense of kinship, and that you actually demonstrate that you are there for all different people, not just for a few people, say for wealthy people, or in the worst cases, sort of for white middle class people.
Mm-hmm.
So these brands typically are not about elitism. They're about inclusion and being there for everyone.
And, on that kind of note of inclusivity, and I think specifically in that instance, affordability as well, you're looking through the ranking. I was expecting to see, when it comes to trust, again, this might be from my own kind of, lack of understanding or, notions of trust myself. I was expecting to see more of these kind of, luxury or legacy kind of brands towards the top end of the ranking. So expecting to see, your big luxury fashion makers or auto manufacturers towards the top. But really, when you look at the list, it is much more everyday brands. It's much more things that we use every day. So I noticed, Netflix comes in at number 5.
Yeah,
I think Netflix is not a luxury service. Netflix is something that pretty much 99% of people do use these days. So why is that those kind of notions of trust don't play as much into the rankings as perhaps you might initially expect?
Yeah, and I mean, the rankings, to be honest, the rankings are something that we don't do the research to create the rankings. The rankings is one way to help benchmark and to understand what does great look like. But that's not the reason that we're doing it. And when we do our research, in fact, every one of the studies that we do is category specific. So we'll do a study on banking. We'll do a study on holiday agents or whatever. And that means that when we're asking people about, do you trust brands or not, then we are getting much more interested in relatively how are you doing against other brands in your category, right? If we look in the UK, there's a huge difference between, well, for example, cars. You mentioned cars. Cars are very average. Okay, so cars as a category, on average, brands in that category sit right slap bang in the middle of our distribution of trust. What's more trusted? Yes, actually, luxury brands are more trusted on average in the UK. Actually, it happens, not necessarily everywhere. But what I'm always interested in is to say, okay, well, if you're going to buy a luxury handbag or apparel or whatever you're looking into, then I'm looking to see, does your brand have an edge over other brands that you might alternatively choose? If I'm driving down the motorway in France looking for petrol, I'm not suddenly going to swerve off and buy a handbag or a pair of jeans just because I trust those brands more. So it's all in context when it's important. Interestingly, communication providers, so our friends at the telecom companies, tend to be on the lower side. So the luxury brands, yes, they do tend to be more trusted because they're taking a big chunk out of your wallet. So you're not going to buy any of them unless you have a level of trust. So they wouldn't be there. Whereas with a comms provider, often it's like you're a bit stuck with who you can go with what you can afford, perhaps, with who's got good signal in your area, whatever else it might be, who's got the right deal, who's got what content on the cable, and so on. So from that point of view, they and also, frankly, I think we all know a lot of the service quality with a lot of the comms providers isn't great. So
Not
people
ideal,
have
no.
had a lot of, maybe not so great experiences, and that reduces their trust. So, so there is a range, and but even though comms providers on the whole are low, maybe what that actually says is that if you can be a trusted comms provider, you'll actually have a massive edge over competitors, because the threshold is that much lower. Whereas in luxury goods, it might be hard to have a competitive edge in trust, because basically I trust all of them.
Yeah.
So, I think, there is, trust works as a threshold, but it also works as a competitive edge. I mean, one of the things, we've looked at this, and what does great trust do for you as a business? Why should I be concerned about trust as a stakeholder in a business? Well, basically because it makes it easier to promote a brand. You'll get better return on your promotional investment if people intrinsically trust it, because they'll be willing to try it. It's easier to innovate. It's easier to retain customers. It's easier to get consumers to renew if you're in that business.
Mm-hmm.
It's easier to cross-sell and to extend what you're selling to people if they basically trust you. And one of the most important things, to come back to your point about everyday brands, is that it creates a habit. It fits so well. If we know that the most successful brands are the brands, actually, in one sense, that people don't consciously think about, just use all the time. Those brands create a habit. That habit is enabled because you have got past any trust defense, as it were, that a consumer might have.
It kind of goes back to what you mentioned before in terms the two types of thinking, like kind of conscious choice versus something that's just much more automatic almost.
Yep.
And that when you mentioned the ecosystem as well, I was thinking, we're recording this podcast, and I'm looking dead ahead at a MacBook, and to my side is an iPhone. I know you mentioned Google earlier, but I feel Apple is very much another one of those companies that instills that kind of sense of trust and buying into that ecosystem. And looking at the report too, it's the second most valuable global brand, as far as the world is concerned. But then you also think that, okay, in terms of pricing, when it comes to you looking at the affordability of things, it is very much within that luxury, that higher end category. So, which way does it fall? From your perspective, does it fall more into that category of this is everyday use, therefore I trust it, and I will keep adding Apple products to my collection? Or does it fall more into that, here's a luxury, trusted, quality company who I can trust reliably? Or is it perhaps a bit of both sometimes?
Well, I guess it comes back to that point about context that I mentioned before. One of my colleagues just wrote a blog post recently talking about price and explicitly comparing the top model from OnePlus and an Apple, I think iPhone 11, I guess, is the current one. They haven't released the 12 yet.
Yeah.
Now, the OnePlus has very similar user ratings. Apparently has a better camera, has more storage and battery life than the Apple, but the iPhone charges 40% more. And I'd argue that a big part of that is a trust gap. That OnePlus hasn't inspired people to bridge that gap, as it were, to Apple. So Apple has got all the consistency and the positives around it. It's a big successful company. It's a reputable company. It's sort of well known for doing things its own way and so on. And OnePlus, for many consumers, they would look at it, they hold it in their hand, they go through the features and so on, and then still, in essence, pretty irrationally, they would say, no, but I'm better off going with the Apple. I know where I am with that. And that's trust. And that's the trust gap that a lot of brands, have to overcome. And for a lot of brands have been successful in that area. We know that there are plenty of other brands coming out of China and so on that have done very well at growing their penetration in many countries, and taking it away from iPhone.
Well, mentioning China, then one of the other companies that is noticeable towards the top of the list is China Mobile, and it reminds me of what you were mentioning before then about things like telecoms providers, or let's say even energy suppliers, your kind of electricity and your gas providers.
Yep.
A lot of the time, I feel in those instances, there's a lack of choice. Depending on where you live, it may only be one or two providers that you have a choice between.
Yeah.
So how does trust factor into that when your choices themselves are much more limited and much more restricted? You're almost forced into a position of having to trust a particular brand to serve your needs.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and maybe one of the worst examples of that is transport. In fact, where you need to go from A to B, and there's very few options perhaps that you've got, particularly in terms of brand choices and terms that you can make. So in those sorts of cases, what usually happens is that trust is operating on the negative threshold, as it were. So, okay, while it continues to work, I'll begrudgingly trust it and keep with it and so on. But if something breaks or repeatedly breaks, possibly even it takes 2-3 bad exceptions to occur, at that point then obviously people will look for something else. Their trust will have been broken, and they'll move on. I mean, the other way is actually almost when brands can be, I hate to say it, but almost like found out. If you're in a category, and this is what's happened to a lot of the holiday companies and airlines that have gone bust over recent years, because cheap airlines have come along and said, you know what, you don't really need to be paying that much to fly from A to B. And actually what that has done is not just said, oh, it's a cheaper price, great. Actually, what it's also done is said, why was I paying so much in the past? Why did I need what were those companies doing with all that money that they didn't really need? Amazon is doing a similar, is having a similar impact in a lot of the retail sectors and so on. And of course, they've been followed. If we look at clothing retail, again, huge churn in those markets at the moment. And yes, partly it is on price, but also it's on trust. And actually that is cutting both ways now, because of course we've seen some clothing manufacturers who've offered very low prices now being held up to say, hang on, you've had low prices, but this is how you're getting them through exploitation. We can't trust you. And so, you're looking at now the conscious consumer who doesn't, maybe has lost some trust in traditional brands because they've been, perhaps overcharging, but a fast fashion brand maybe is suspect from other reasons as well. So you're getting some conflict there, and the brands that get that balance right possibly are going to be the ones that are going to be in the best position going forwards.
I just have to note that the example you gave before about the public transport, particularly struck a chord with me as someone who grew up in a Yorkshire village with 2 buses an hour, which were frequently late, running both ways. So that was, I felt that example very deeply. One of the other things, and you mentioned briefly there as well previously, is a number of brands coming out of China in particular. There's whether it's technology, whether it's other services, and the one that struck me, and the one that you also single out within the article as well, is TikTok, as one of the new entrants coming fairly high up in the rankings straight away. How are you seeing? Is there a difference in the way that these brands that maybe they are new in the West, but perhaps also new in China for the domestic market? Is there a difference in the way that they are kind of engendering and building that trust among consumers at what seems to be a really rapid pace as well? It doesn't take as many years. It's almost overnight.
Yes. I mean, obviously, we don't have the long-term evidence of those brands yet, Will they also, be able to sustain that trust over time? We don't know. But what they're doing particularly well is, I think, identifying with consumers,
Mm.
showing consumers that they've been developed for them, that they aren't there to rip you off and so on. Now, obviously, with TikTok, it's had a slightly heated recent history
Yeah.
through political intervention, but not through consumer intervention. It's almost that massive trust that the platform gained that maybe has worried some of the political players, and that is why it's in the position it's in. But for consumers, it's like, this is simple. Obviously, being free always helps
Mhm.
with these apps and so on, and online services. But it's clearly designed for people like them, and they feel so much more at home with it because of that than with maybe a more established social media that their mum and their granny are on and so on.
Yeah.
That is what trust means to them. Trust is all about what me and my friends and my close circle are about, and that's how they've been very successful. And
Mhm.
they often are very simple. Simplicity is actually quite an overlooked component of trust. Actually, complexity is. Somebody was talking to me the other day about Starbucks loyalty scheme and loyalty card, and how complicated it is,
Hmm.
and just the simple nature of having a complex set of rules that then feels much less open and honest. So you're trying to catch me out. You're trying to not have to do what I think you're saying that you're offering me, and so on. Um, I like simple things. Most people consider themselves reasonably simple people, um, and
Yeah.
and and brands shouldn't take up a lot of time in our lives. So simplicity is another aspect of it as well. And brands that either simplify your life and/or are themselves simple things are often, the ones that people will say, "Great, that's exactly what I need. I don't have to think about it. I trust you to do the job."
So simplicity is it's a very interesting thing that you just mentioned, because I'm thinking now recently of how many brands, particularly newer brands, you see advertised with that concept of simplicity at the core. Whether it's
Mm,
simple connectivity for technology, or direct to consumer kind of selling from companies that aren't going via brick and mortar stores.
yeah.
I think that there's definitely.
I
Have
think
you seen a kind of
banks
increase
are a
in that?
really interesting example of that. If you look at what banks have tried to do, and indeed
Mm.
over the COVID crisis has become particularly important, and that's move your banking online. So it used to be, we're in control. You have to come to us at the branch. There'll be a big screen. We'll mutter incomprehensibly. We'll use lots of language and jargon and so on. But what the fintechs have done in leading the way in changing banking is to say, we don't need all of that. We're going to simplify those 32 pages of terms and conditions down to maybe two, and actually the print won't even be that small on those two. We'll make it easy for you to just flick open an app, scroll up and down, and see exactly where you've been spending your money. We'll even put it into a graphical format so you can
Yeah.
visualize, your money, rather than it just being numbers and numbers and numbers. We'll show you some pictures. We'll be easily able to show you, you're spending more this month than you did last month. Are you happy with that? Or you didn't spend as much this month, you've got this much that you could save. And they're simplifying the processes all the way through. But, still, in theory, making money out of it in the end. Of course, a lot of the fintechs are struggling quite to get to that point yet, but, that's the objective.
And I think that leads nicely onto the other notion that we've kind of touched upon a few times in the conversation so far, that concept of, transparency and understandability, yeah, and ultimately, kind of corporate accountability, corporate social responsibility. Now, this is a topic that is quite close to my heart. I wrote my master's thesis on it a couple of years ago. So I'm curious, to get your take based on the research. Are we seeing an increase in trust from consumers in these brands that are more increasing their transparency, or increasingly, either marketed on being responsible or demonstrating, of course, that they are responsible as well? Is there a move towards more consumer trust in these brands that are good for whether it's the environment, whether it's human rights? Is there on average a kind of increase in that?
There is, very simply put. So I don't think that we had previously really tried to quantify, the impact of all these different aspects on trust specifically, but we have definitely seen, quite a significant uplift in consumer awareness of corporate responsibility, and of the impact that that awareness is having then on trust and ultimately on brand choices. So yeah, those are all pretty important factors. And when we looked at what made up a company's corporate reputation this year and compared it to 10 years ago, responsibility, so these four factors that we include in that, so that's environmental responsibility, social responsibility, responsible towards your employees, and towards your supply chain, so those four things put together, they're now, in terms of overall responsibility perceptions, that's 3 times as important. It's contributing 3 times as much to reputation. Other factors, just like purely how successful the brand is, that used to be the dominant factor. The company. So in terms of a corporate, what you were looking for previously was much more just the signal that this was a big, successful company. Therefore, it's got a good reputation. And now it's less about that and much more about being a responsible company. And I think when you think about the number of different corporate issues that we've had over the last decade and more, I'm really not surprised by that. But the data actually is what showed it to us. You've got a model that was built 10 years ago. We've repeated that model building exercise, and as I said, what it comes out to is that, corporate reputational factors on average account for something like 9% of the influences on your brand choice. Now, actually, that doesn't sound very much, but that's quite significant amount of influence for something that's pretty intangible. And as I said, most of the time we're not really thinking all that much about our brand choices. So that halo, or whatever the opposite of a halo is, if it's not a good thing,
the whole thing is
the company can add or subtract from a brand, pretty significant, and certainly something that every business needs to be aware of and thinking about. And as I've said, can be a reason why that trust gap exists, or why trust can collapse in a brand.
And are we seeing, I think a few years ago, this notion of someone like the conscious consumer, they seemed like quite a distinct category with distinct brands kind of catering to that market. Are we seeing, as you mentioned, as the past 10 years, that things have gone on, and there have been these corporate scandals that have come to light. I recall things like, the Rana Plaza collapse in Bangladesh with the clothing manufacturers. Are we seeing that kind of bracket of the conscious consumer actually morphing more into, consumers overall? It's no longer a subset. Yeah. It's more.
No. It's a diffuse. I wouldn't say it's 100% of people by any means. But yeah, it has diffused through the population, and in general, it's more important in some categories than in others. Where all brands are doing it well in a category, obviously that cancels out the impact it'll have on brand choice often. So it won't appear to be as important. But yes, it seems to be much more widespread.
Well, I think speaking of, brands being conscious of things that are going on, we can't not speak about what's been going on during the past close to 8 months of this year, which is of course during the COVID crisis. And I think there's been a lot of discussion that I've seen as well about brand behavior during this time. How are they catering to customers? How are they maintaining trust from customers? Or perhaps how are some of them even increasing trust from customers during this crisis period? From the research that you've done, have you seen examples of brands who have managed to, through the pandemic, through the kind of global crisis, increase the trust that they're getting from consumers? And are there any particular ways that they have been doing that?
Well, let me first say, just one of the things that we do every year is to put a value on brands that companies own. So we have a global effort on that. In June every year, we publish a ranking of the top 100 brands plus rankings of individual categories. And then we have separate rankings of the top most valuable brands in individual countries, from US and UK to China and India and many other countries around the world, Brazil and Germany and Italy and so on. Now, what we've seen when we look at some of that data is that brands that were already most trusted brands going into the COVID crisis, that quality has helped those companies that own those brands to resist some of the downward pressure that all the economic shock it's created has done.
Yeah.
And we can clearly see that for particularly for established brands, strong established trust gives you greater resilience to these economic shocks. Now, going on from that, to look at who's done best, I think that there have been short-term and potentially longer-term impacts, and some of those are indeed through trust. So what we have tended to see in the short term is that brands that were already leading in a category or dominant in a category or doing well in a category have tended to do a little bit better through this period. And again, we think that fundamental trust that people had is one of the drivers for that. So it's, again, partly that resilience, but also in a time of greater uncertainty, then that fundamental trust and the emotional response that you have to a brand can become more important and can take over a little bit more. So I think that, from that point of view, we've seen some of the larger brands, get a little bit of a boost. And it was interesting. I was looking, it's not consistent around the world. Curiously, in India, a lot of trust scores have gone down, but across the board. So it doesn't seem to be like there's any brands doing anything particularly badly wrong. It's just people maybe in a time of greater crisis, they're not sure who to trust, maybe in that environment. But in a lot of countries, and in the UK, for example, we have seen in general about a 2 to 3% increase in endorsing brands as a brand I trust, and some of the lifts have been bigger than that as well. So just a few brands that actually old, well established and trusted, like Marks and Spencers, or Nationwide, Building Society, Next as well, and similarly, in the Netherlands, ING has done well. In South Africa, FNB, First National Bank, has done well. So a range of brands have done well, and often it can be just simply because they can tell people honestly, we've always been here for you. Don't panic. Don't worry. Everything's gone to hell in a handbasket, but we're still here, and just have to pick up the phone and talk to us at Nationwide, or we'll deliver what you need from M&S or whatever else it might be. So I think those are some of the brands that have done well. I think there's been a huge range of responses, and authenticity has been a really important part of that.
Hmm.
And I think one of the interesting things is, we talked about corporate reputation. Um, a lot of brands have tried to say, "Oh, look, we've done this. Um, we've made masks or hand sanitizer or something."
Yeah.
Um, Now, if that doesn't really fit with what they've been doing for the previous 10, 20, 50, 100 years, um, it's not really going to do anything very much. So I think the first thing that we would say we've observed is that, has the response been authentic?
Hmm.
Um, and, even to the extent that if you're a brand that's all about having fun, to suddenly try and say, "Oh, we're also very responsible, and look, we've done this," that doesn't sound authentic. I mean, there probably is a way, perhaps, that something like that could be expressed, maybe. But that's not an easy thing to do. So there'd be a big challenge on a brand to do that, and for some of those brands, just keeping quiet perhaps has been the best thing to do. Um,
Yeah.
so I think sometimes brands have benefited from going out into the market and reassuring people or offering something that fits with how they're already seen. I don't think I would say I've seen many, if any, examples of brands that have come up with some sort of new response to
Hmm.
the pandemic that's then really bolstered them.
I also, I mean, I recognize a lot of, kind of what you mentioned previously with these brands who said, we've always been there. That does make you think a lot of, continuity as well, like kind of continuity of a service or continuity of supply. And one of the brands that you also, single out in the article that you wrote for Research World is Netflix,
Mm.
which to me is a bit of a strange case because okay, it is a continuous service, but at the same time, it's not. They don't have to manufacture anything physical in that sense, but it's more in terms of that providing that stream of new content. Whether it's Tiger King or whatever else that keeps us all that keeps us all occupied. But I think when that kind of everyday usage that almost it morphs into something like a necessity, can you really see an increase in trust when it's something that is just so I think basic, for lack of a better word, or something that's
Yeah.
just so
Yeah.
integrated into your day to day?
Yeah. We can see it if it's an area where, through the crisis, it's become more apparent that I need this thing, and therefore I'm more reliant on it, and therefore trust becomes more important. The more you're reliant on something, the more you have to trust it, and so therefore the more likely you are to recognize sort of explicitly that this is a great brand, this is one I can really rely on and trust. So I think yes, and I think possibly the banking area is one of those areas. People really don't want to think about banks, frankly, but maybe at a time when your employment's uncertain and your mortgage repayments are uncertain and all of these other things. That's the time when you need to be able to talk to your bank. So it becomes much more important. Interestingly, I don't think I saw any car brands had increased in trust. Of course, we've all been using our cars a lot less
Yeah.
during COVID, and the things that they do to generate trust are not relevant or much less
Hmm.
relevant during this time. So, I think that's the two sides of it there. Um, and interestingly, almost all the advertising for cars in the Western world, at least at the moment, is around electric and sort of zero emission cars.
Yeah.
Or low emission cars. And I do wonder about that, sort of just, and this is more from a theoretical point of view. It's not something I've looked into the data on, but,
Mm.
this is something that maybe I'm not even using my car at the moment. You're reminding me that my car isn't a good car. It's one of the bad cars. And, I'm uncertain about my economic future. So I can't even think about replacing it anytime soon.
Yeah.
So, you're sort of dangling this thing in front of me. And again, does that feel like identification? Does that feel like the brand is being inclusive, and trying to really empathize and relate to customers? So, that I think, is an interesting example. There could be some tension there, and maybe, although brand awareness is a very important thing to sustain, and certainly, there are very few brands that we would advocate switch off your advertising for 6 or 8 months. Just because it's cost you so much more to get back to a level that you had before than if you try to maintain it. But yeah, the messaging there, they're sort of trapped a little bit between a rock and a hard place, I think, in the automotive industry.
And speaking of messaging, and what you're mentioning before as well, in terms of actions that companies and brands have or have not been taking, perhaps through the course of the crisis. Are there any kind of markers of brands that are crafting messaging that does come across as genuine, that does come across as, sincere? Because I think we've all received plenty of emails from our mailing list and whatever that say, like, we're here with you through these difficult times, and you think, that's nonsense, I'm going to delete you, I'm not going to read this anyway. Are there some kind of clear markers of when you can see brands over the past few months that have done something, you think, this does feel right, this does feel like it's coming from a place of sincerity, a place of wanting to support their consumers?
Yeah, I mean, the number of letters that CEOs have had to write recently is just ridiculous, isn't it? I pity them almost, apart from their salaries. But to be honest, I think we could probably talk for another hour about the impacts of COVID and so on.
Mm-hmm.
And I would probably say some of my colleagues, we've worked on a COVID barometer. We've been, outside of the Brand Z project that I'm associated with, there's been an awful lot of other work done by Kantar around this and helping them. And I'd probably have to say there's nothing much immediately that I think I can cite to you. And actually, we are more interested in Brand Z on the long-term effects. And I think, even the best short-term effect that somebody's hit upon a great little, way to express themselves during the crisis, I think we're much more interested in what's working for brands in the longer term. And I think that's the fundamentally most important things. In the end, this crisis is exactly that. It's a crisis. It will pass. There will be some changes in consumer behavior and so on as a result, which brands and companies will need to adapt to. Mm-hmm. But fundamentally, people are still going to need brands after this crisis. They're going to have many of the same needs in terms of what products they're going to want to buy and so on. And so therefore, marketing itself isn't going to change as a result of COVID. And I would probably say to people, being consistent, we've talked a lot about that word consistency, being consistent with who you are, what you do, what you're known for, is probably the most useful thing that you can do right now.
I think you almost preempted my next question there, because I was going to ask you, looking into the future, looking beyond the current situation that we're in. I think you've explained that perfectly well. And I think if I had to add anything to that question, it would be, from my point of view and from what I see as a consumer day to day, is almost there's a huge increase in the amount of choice. I think going back to that concept of choice, from the very start, the number of brands that are out there, the proliferation of new brands, startups and everything else. Do you see that increase in choice in a lot of different areas playing a greater role as we go forwards as well? So not just messaging as we come out of COVID, et cetera, but the fact that consumers are going to be presented with so many more options for so many more things as we move forward over the next, maybe perhaps 5-10 years.
It's an interesting one. Yes. I mean, in a lot of areas, the cost of entry to a category, to a market, has been considerably reduced, which allows this proliferation of choice. But markets and categories we'll typically go through some cycles on this, so there will be some shakeout. Yes, we live in a constant world of disruption now. So any brand, either has to be a disruptor or it'll get disrupted. It seems to be a very simple truth now, that's the way worlds are working. So I think you, as a brand owner, you will need to be continually conscious of where the next wave of competition could be coming from. One of the things that we're doing a lot more of now at Kantar is scenario planning, so that we can look at trends, forecast possible future scenarios, and help brands and companies to game different scenarios and work out, both, okay, do we need a contingency plan? What should those be? But also, what are we going to be doing to get onto the front foot and not have to respond to that? I think simplicity, for me, still comes up again and again. One of the key dimensions that we measure on Brand Z, and we haven't actually been measuring it for all that long, but it's something that we recognized we needed to do, was just we ask for each brand a whole range of questions, but one of them is, which of these brands fits easily into your everyday life? And fundamentally, that is what brands have to do. So we've talked a lot, in other areas about friction, and typically it's considered in the purchase environment. You want frictionless purchasing, although there's also been some argument that you should actually add a little bit of friction back into some of the purchasing process so people appreciate what they're buying. But I think, people overall have complex lives. As you say, not only has the number of brands in a category often increased, the number of categories we have to think about for things has increased. Simplification, reducing the friction in your product, being open and transparent, so simplifying in that way, and just looking at the consumer, the customer first, and designing around them.
Absolutely. Well, I think, Graham, we could absolutely, as you said before, we could talk about this for another hour. And I think in future, I'd definitely love to have you back on, because the COVID barometer sounds fascinating to me. And I think looking back on this after another few months, maybe our conversation will be entirely different. Who knows? But thank you very, very much for joining us and for sharing your insights on a really, really interesting topic. And I think something that, as you mentioned right at the start, is subconscious for quite a lot of us. It's fantastic to see it kind of put into something more digestible. So thank you.
Pleasure to talk to you, and good luck with the podcast.
Thank you. And thank you as always to all of our listeners for joining again for this episode. I do hope you enjoyed the discussion with Graham. Hopefully you've learned something new, and I hope you'll join us again next time. If you do enjoy the show, check us out on SoundCloud or Spotify, and do make sure to read Graham's article along with many more interesting reads on Research World as well. If you have any ideas for the podcast in the meantime, you can contact us via podcast@esomar.org. And until next time, stay safe, stay healthy, and most of all, please do stay curious. Thank you, and we'll see you again next time.